I walked into the Westbridge County Courthouse just as the morning chill settled into the stone walls, the kind of cold that doesn't bite the skin but sinks deeper into memory. My boots echoed once on the marble floor, sharp and unmistakable. That sound alone drew their attention. My mother laughed. It wasn't loud, it never was. It was a soft, clipped sound, carefully controlled, like everything else about her, but it cut straight through my chest. I didn't need to look at her to know the expression on her face. I had known it my entire life. Amused, dismissive, certain. Beside her, my father shook his head slowly, eyes downcast, as if he were already mourning my defeat. That gesture, so familiar it almost felt scripted, had followed me through childhood, college, my first job, every moment I dared to step out of line. It said, "You never learn." It said, "This will end badly for you." They thought they were watching a spectacle, a daughter finally unraveling, a mistake that would be corrected in public. They were wrong. My name is Eleanor Hale. I am 39 years old, and I was not there to defend myself. I was there to end them. The courtroom smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, with a trace of bitter coffee lingering in the air. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, cutting the room into pale stripes of gold and shadow. For a moment, it felt less like a courtroom and more like a cathedral, quiet, solemn, and waiting for a sacrifice. I took my seat at the plaintiff's table. Alone. No attorney sat beside me, no whispered advice, no comforting nods. Just a thick binder resting under my hand and a single glass of water. The absence was intentional. A lawyer would have tried to soften this, to negotiate, to talk about reconciliation, settlements, and preserving relationships. I wasn't here to preserve anything. By sitting alone, I was saying something they didn't understand yet. This wasn't business as usual. This wasn't a family dispute. This was personal, deliberate, and irreversible. Across the aisle, my parents sat in the front row, perfectly positioned for visibility. My mother, Margaret Hale, was immaculate as always. Tailored suit, pearls resting neatly against her collarbone. Her posture was rigid, regal, unyielding. She looked like a woman who had never once doubted her right to control the room. When her eyes met mine, her lips curved into that familiar smile, the one she used when she believed she was watching a child play at adulthood. The same smile she wore years ago when I brought her my first accomplishment, and she set it aside without a second glance. My father, Richard Hale, looked smaller than I remembered. His suit hung loosely on his frame. He stared at his hands, fingers loosely intertwined, as if he could fold himself into invisibility. Once, his name had filled headlines. Once, he had been called a visionary. Now he looked like a man who had spent decades choosing silence because it was easier than conflict. I felt something stir in my chest. Not pity. That had burned out long ago. What remained was colder, clearer. A sharp crack of the gavel snapped the room to attention. "All rise." The judge entered, her expression unreadable, her movements brisk and precise. She took her seat and surveyed the room with a gaze that tolerated neither theatrics nor excuses. "We are here to hear case number 2174, she said. "Hale versus Hale." A murmur rippled through the gallery. I could feel it then, the weight of every eye in the room pressing into my back. Family friends, former employees, people who had watched me grow up under the glow of my parents' reputation. I didn't have to hear their thoughts to know them. Ungrateful, spoiled, disloyal. What kind of person sues her own parents? I kept my spine straight and my eyes forward. They thought this was a family drama, a messy emotional implosion. They had no idea they were sitting inside an execution. From the corner of my vision, I sensed the shift beside me. My mother leaned slightly toward my father, her voice low but sharp enough to carry. "She won't dare," she said. It wasn't a comment. It was an order, the final echo of a lifetime spent deciding who I was allowed to be. I didn't look at her. I opened my binder. The sound of the rings separating was quiet, almost delicate, but in the stillness of the courtroom, it landed like a warning shot. Page after page rested inside. Documents, records, contracts. 16 years of silence bound together in black and white. I felt it then, unmistakably. This was the moment everything broke. The family I had tried to protect. The name I had been taught to serve. The version of myself that had learned to disappear to keep the peace. All of it was about to collapse. I lifted my gaze, meeting the judge's eyes with a steadiness that surprised even me. I wasn't afraid. I was finished being erased, and for the first time in my life, I knew exactly how this would end. They used to call us the perfect family. In Lakeshore, our name carried weight. Hale Systems wasn't just a company, it was a symbol. People spoke about it the way they spoke about old money and new genius merged into one inevitable success story. At charity galas and business luncheons, strangers would smile at me with admiration I hadn't earned, telling me how lucky I was to be born into something so powerful. They never asked what it cost. My father, Richard Hale, was the face on magazine covers. Calm, brilliant, visionary. He knew how to speak in numbers that made investors feel safe. He knew how to stand at podiums and make growth sound inevitable. My mother, Margaret Hale, was the one people didn't see as often, but everyone felt her presence. She ran human resources, operations, and strategy with a precision that bordered on surgical. Employees trusted her. They confided in her. They feared her without fully understanding why. At home, her philosophy was even clearer. "We don't raise daughters," she once said at dinner, her voice smooth, almost proud. "We build legacies." I was 12 when I first understood that sentence wasn't meant to inspire me. It was meant to define me. In our house, emotions were liabilities. Curiosity was tolerated only if it served a purpose. Wanting something for myself was quietly corrected, framed as immaturity or selfishness. Love was conditional, dispensed in measured doses when I performed well, and withdrawn when I didn't. I learned early how to disappear without leaving the room. When I graduated with a degree in computer science, I thought, briefly, that things might change. I had worked hard. I had excelled. I had built something of my own in my head, even if I had never been encouraged to speak it out loud. I imagined, foolishly, that I might finally be invited upstairs. Instead, I was escorted down. The IT department sat in the basement of the Hale Systems headquarters, tucked beneath layers of glass offices and executive suites. It was bright in a clinical way, all white light and humming servers. Functional, invisible. My mother called it a support role when she handed me my badge, her tone kind but final. "You're good with systems," she said. "This is where you're most useful." That word stayed with me. Useful. I threw myself into the work because it was the one place where silence felt earned. Lines of code didn't judge me. Systems responded to logic, not expectations. Over time, my responsibilities grew quietly, without announcements or promotions. I designed frameworks. I rebuilt infrastructure. I created a software ecosystem that touched everything from supply chain logistics to internal security and payroll. I watched Hale Systems become faster, leaner, stronger, powered by something no one ever saw. They eventually named it Hale Core Suite. I remember the first time it was mentioned in a board presentation. The room applauded. My father nodded approvingly. A senior executive spoke about innovation and teamwork. No one said my name. I waited for it anyway, the way you wait for thunder after lightning, certain it has to come. It didn't. I told myself it was temporary. That recognition would follow results. That family didn't need credit. That this was loyalty, not erasure. Years passed that way, measured in product launches and quiet victories no one attributed to me. At company events, I sat with other staff members while my parents stood under spotlights. I clapped with everyone else, smiling carefully, rehearsed and hollow. Then one night, long after most of the building had gone dark, I found something I wasn't supposed to see. I was running a routine system check when an unfamiliar folder appeared on my screen. Executive level, restricted. The kind of thing my access should never have touched. I hesitated, then opened it. Inside were acquisition documents. Hale Systems was being prepared for sale. I scrolled through projections, valuations, legal summaries, my pulse slowing instead of racing. This was how my mind worked when something was wrong. Calm came first, fear followed later. Then I reached the section labeled Digital Assets. There it was. Hale Core Suite, valued at over $400 million. I stared at the number until it stopped meaning anything, until it became abstract, almost unreal. Then my eyes moved down the page, searching for something simple, something human. Lead developer. The space beside it was empty, blank. In that moment, the room felt smaller. The hum of the servers grew louder, pressing against my ears. 16 years of work reduced to a line item, detached from its source, presented as if it had emerged on its own. I was cold with understanding. To my family, I was infrastructure. And infrastructure, once built, is not thanked. It is used, absorbed, and forgotten until it breaks. I didn't knock when I walked into my mother's office. The door to the top floor was usually closed, guarded by assistants and quiet rules about access. But that morning, it stood open, flooded with light from the city below. Margaret Hale sat behind her desk, phone pressed to her ear, voice smooth and confident as she negotiated someone else's future. She lifted one finger at me without looking up, a reflex she'd perfected over decades. I didn't wait. I crossed the room and placed my phone on her desk, screen glowing between us. The document was still open, the page I hadn't slept over, the one that had changed the temperature of my blood. She glanced down, then back up at me, her expression unreadable. She finished her call calmly, promised a revised draft by noon, and hung up. Only then did she lean back in her chair. "Eleanor," she said, folding her hands, "what is this about?" "The developer credit," I replied. My voice surprised me. It was steady, almost distant. "It's blank." "Why?" She sighed, the kind of weary exhale reserved for inconvenient questions. Rising from her chair, she walked toward the window, her back to me, surveying the city as if it belonged to her by natural law. "The sale is delicate," she said. "Attaching individual names complicates the transfer of intellectual property. It's standard practice." "I'm not a contractor," I said. "That system is my work." She turned then, eyes sharp, assessing. "You're thinking too narrowly. This isn't about you. It's about the family, about protecting what we've built." I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anger yet, but recognition. "You want me to disappear," I said quietly. Her mouth curved into a small, almost affectionate smile. "You're being dramatic. Think about your father. Think about the valuation. This is not the moment to make a scene." That word landed heavily between us. A scene. As if asking for my name was an emotional outburst rather than a fact. I looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time I saw no mother in the room. Only an executive protecting an asset. I nodded once, not in agreement, but in understanding, and walked out without another word. She didn't stop me. A week later, I was called into a conference room I'd never used before. A mid-level manager sat across from me, eyes fixed somewhere above my shoulder. He spoke in rehearsed phrases about restructuring and synergy. He slid an envelope across the table and avoided my gaze. My position had been eliminated. The severance package was generous. The non-disclosure agreement was absolute. All it required was my silence. I signed without comment. They watched me leave that night from the glass walls of the executive floor, relieved, confident they had contained the damage. I didn't take a box with me. There was nothing to pack. My work had never belonged to me in that building, at least not on paper. The apartment I moved into sat miles away from Lakeshore, small and unremarkable. Thin walls, a view of a parking lot. It was the first place that felt quiet in a way I could breathe through. I set my laptop on the kitchen table and began to read. I hadn't looked at my employment contract in years. It had been handed to me when I was 23, explained quickly, signed confidently, and filed away. Page after page blurred together until my eyes caught on a clause buried deep in the appendices. Clause 22C. The language was dry, almost dismissive in tone, but its meaning was unmistakable. If intellectual property was not formally registered and attributed within 1 year, ownership reverted to the original developer. I read it again, then again. My hands began to shake, not with fear, but with something colder and more precise. In 16 years, Hale Systems had never registered my authorship, not once. Every line of code, every architecture decision, every system that powered the company existed without my name attached. The silence in the apartment felt different after that. Charged, alive. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I opened my laptop and went to work. At night, when the city outside went quiet, I moved through archived emails and server logs with a familiarity that felt almost intimate. I found directives marked urgent, requests labeled cleanup, messages sent from my mother's account instructing IT to remove developer tags, to strip comments, to ensure the software appeared seamless and ownerless. It wasn't negligence, it was policy. I saved everything, copied it, organized it, created a record that told the story no one else had bothered to read. With each file, something shifted inside me. The hurt didn't disappear, but it hardened into clarity. I filed the motion myself. There was no warning and no spectacle. While Hale Systems was still presenting confidence to investors and polishing press releases for a sale they believed was secure, a sealed request reached a judge's desk asking for an immediate freeze on specific digital assets. The wording was precise, technical, and difficult to ignore. Within hours, access to the software was restricted. By the afternoon, acquisition talks slowed. By evening, they stopped. I followed the developments from my kitchen table, watching the tone of the news change in real time. At first, the headlines were cautious. Analysts spoke in careful phrases about unforeseen legal complications. Then my name appeared, paired with the company's, and the story hardened into something sharper. Cameras gathered outside headquarters. Commentators speculated openly. The silence I had lived in for years was suddenly gone. My mother responded immediately. She stood before reporters with practiced ease, her voice calm and concerned, as if she were explaining a family inconvenience rather than a legal challenge. She spoke about stress, misunderstanding, and her worries about my mental state. The implication was clear and familiar. This was not a claim to be taken seriously, but an emotional episode. I didn't answer her. I had learned long ago that arguing with her version of events only fed it. Instead, I waited for the only place where facts still mattered. The courtroom was full on the day of the hearing. Reporters filled the benches, notebooks open, eyes fixed. My parents sat together across the aisle, close enough to look unified. My father stared ahead, jaw tight. My mother sat perfectly still, as composed as ever. When it was my turn, I stood and placed the contract before the judge. I walked through it carefully, line by line, explaining the terms, the timelines, and the requirements of Clause 22C. I explained what the company had been obligated to do and what it had never done. There was no emotion in my voice, only sequence and clarity. Then I introduced the supporting evidence. Emails appeared on the screen behind me, projected large enough for everyone to read. Instructions sent from executive accounts, requests to remove developer identifiers, directives to clean records and strip attribution. The dates aligned precisely with major internal milestones. The room went quiet. My mother studied the screen, her expression tightening as the pattern became impossible to dismiss. My father didn't move at all. No one interrupted. When the judge spoke, her decision was clear and final. Based on the evidence, ownership of the software known as Hale Core Suite was awarded to me. There was no reaction inside the courtroom, only the subtle shift that comes when something breaks beyond repair. Outside, the consequences moved faster than anyone expected. Markets reacted sharply. The acquisition was formally suspended. Analysts withdrew forecasts. Within days, my father resigned. Shortly after, regulatory scrutiny followed, focused not on family conflict, but on compliance failures and internal conduct. I left the courthouse without answering questions. I didn't stop to watch the fallout or comment on the coverage. That story would write itself. What mattered had already been recorded, in language that could not be softened or reinterpreted. For the first time, my work and my name existed in the same place, acknowledged by the only authority my family had ever respected. Everything else was noise. The meeting room was empty when I arrived. No cameras, no lawyers, no assistants hovering near the door. Just a long table, 3 chairs, and the low hum of the building settling into evening. My parents were already there, seated across from one another, not beside each other the way they had been in court. The distance between them felt intentional, as if the performance was finally over. My mother spoke first. "So," she said, folding her hands neatly on the table, "what did you gain from all of this?" Her tone was calm, almost curious, as though we were discussing a business decision that hadn't gone as planned. She wasn't angry. She wasn't apologetic. She was assessing the outcome, still convinced there had to be a measurable advantage. I met her gaze without hesitation. "So I would stop confusing betrayal with loyalty," I said. The words surprised her, not because she didn't understand them, but because she had never expected to hear them out loud. She blinked once, then looked away. My father shifted in his seat, his voice quieter than I remembered. "We made you strong," he said. Everything you are came from discipline, from pressure. I shook my head slowly. No, I replied. You didn't make me strong. You made me cold. I learned how to survive without being seen, not how to belong. The room fell silent. There was nothing left to argue, no angle to recover. This wasn't a negotiation or a reckoning. It was a closing statement. I stood, pushed my chair back, and walked toward the door. Neither of them tried to stop me. For the first time, I didn't wait for permission to leave. I returned to the Hale Systems building later that night. The lobby lights were dimmed, the space quieter than it had ever been during my years there. I passed familiar hallways without slowing, moving through them as if they finally recognized me. When I reached the basement level, the place where I had spent most of my career, I paused. The servers still hummed the same way they always had. Steady, reliable, honest. I logged in. The screen loaded slowly, then resolved into a simple confirmation line at the top of the system dashboard. Owner, Eleanor Hale. I stared at it longer than necessary, not because I doubted it, but because I had never seen my name occupy space so cleanly before. There were no footnotes, no asterisks, no effort to minimize it. The system acknowledged what it always had known. I took the elevator to the top floor. The executive office was empty, the city spread out below in sheets of light and rain. Lakeshore looked different from up there, less imposing, more human. Cars moved through wet streets. Windows glowed in apartment buildings. Life continued, indifferent to legacies and last names. I stood by the glass, listening to the rain tap against it softly. There was no rush of victory, no satisfaction in collapse. What I felt instead was quiet, the kind that settles after a long noise, finally stops. I hadn't destroyed my family. I had stopped carrying what they refused to acknowledge. I hadn't taken something from them. I had taken myself back. For the first time, my name existed without explanation. Thank you for listening to this story. If you stayed with it from beginning to end, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, please like and subscribe. Your support makes the next story possible.